Hello and welcome to my friend the Rainbow Circle. This is a cool effect. I like it. Well, anyway, I wanted to talk about horror movies, of course. One of my favorite types of movies to watch. And it's an interesting one to study in terms of just the nature of storytelling. But I thought about doing a horror movie top 10, which I watch a lot of horror movie top 10s. Just to get some ideas of new things to watch, because I sort of binge them nonstop sometimes, especially around this time of year. It is October. But just the nature of top 10s, if you're really wanting to explore what they really reveal about good stories, and you're framing it in terms of a top 10, there's a couple of obstacles to doing it that way. One of them is just the nature of the canon that develops. There's a feedback loop that sort of creates a canon. This relates to, in surprising ways, Harold Bloom. I talked about Harold Bloom really briefly. But the whole idea that people presenting what is the best horror movie of all time, for example, in lists and whatever else, it creates a feedback loop in that The Shining and Night of the Living Dead and Psycho, whatever else, Suspiria, movies like that, Rosemary's Baby, movies like that almost always make the top 4 or 5 or whatever. And so, is it possible to explore those then based on what they genuinely show about what everyone would see as a good story? They're amazing movies. I love those movies, but if you're breaking them apart, I mean, they've also been explored very, 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 very thoroughly. Like The Shining has a whole movie just about interpreting The Shining. So, what else is there really to say? Partly, but also, how can we objectively say those are the best when everybody says they're the best? What effect does conformity have? Conformity to what's expected of you in listing, the top 10 or whatever. And that's a lot of it goes into the, the debate over the canon. Or canon pieces of literature, canon because they've always been on the canon. Is it a feedback loop? Is Shakespeare great because he's genuinely great, apart from being Shakespeare, or is Shakespeare great because he's Shakespeare? So it's a silly sort of list to make. Top 10 horror movies, really just based on what I enjoy, but has a lot of implications in just how you approach something like that. And top 10 lists in and of themselves are narratives, especially considering just like the expectations of the audience and conforming to the canon so a lot of the times it's will Psycho be above The Shining? Will Night of the Living Dead be number 7 instead of number 3? Oh no! If that's number 7, what could possibly be number 3? So it's a narrative in a sense, where it's designed to build suspense, and so you have to consider how much of the canon of horror movies are you going to put in the top. How are you going to throw some surprises in there? But another choice that really, for a list that really affects the objectivity of whether or not they're legitimately good movies. I mean, good movie is really just entirely 100% subjective, but how can you separate that from factors other than the movie itself, I should say? Is it affected by the canon, or is it affected by another aspect of audience perception in that fuels the choice to pick obscure movies? Why? My dog's going to start barking. Okay. To pick obscure movies. Why does somebody pick an obscure movie? Is it because you genuinely love the obscure movie? Giving the benefit of the doubt, that's possible. My dog's barked too much. I'm going to put him in. We're not in a Stephen King movie right now. No talking cars or evil dogs. They might be barking too much. Hold on. So it's picking something for its obscurity, genuinely a choice of the quality of the movie, possibly giving the benefit of the doubt. Yeah, it could be. That tends to be why I watch those lists, is to find something that somebody genuinely loves that is more obscure. But a lot of that could be the social perception. It's sort of the hipster mentality, the stereotypical hipster mentality. I'm going to choose the most obscure thing in order to look cool. Part of that mentality is also good, bad movies, movies you love ironically, movies that are superficially bad, but are enjoyable to watch, regardless. Which, there's value to that. And I talked about. I think just the whole nature of good, bad movies should make us reevaluate how we define good and bad. I mean, any sort of duality is highly problematic anyway. But just to break apart, I mean, there's not really a better term for it that I know of, but just the whole concept of a good, bad movie. It's good because you like it. I mean, that's ultimately the measure. Where's the bad part come in? It's bad because it's superficially bad based on, traditional standards of what quote-unquote good movies are. But, ultimately that's meaningless. But your experience of it might be different. Your experience might be, you might be laughing at the movie. You might have this ironic distance where you're ridiculing the movie and that's what makes it entertaining, or it's really charming. That's some of the best good, bad movies are maybe technically flawed, but, have a good heart. Those are very, very entertaining. Some of my favorites, indeed. So could I possibly make a top 10 list that disregards both of those motivations? Choosing a piece that is not canon, so I don't conform to what I'm supposed to identify as canon. I love all those movies, but I love pretty much every horror movie, to be honest. But and not choosing something that's obscure just motivated by social perception. Both of those motivations are really outside of the actual movie itself. A lot of the times that they end up on those lists is because they do have genuinely wonderful, delightful qualities. But those choices might taint it. So it's really hard to actually, I've been trying to figure that out. It's really hard actually to do that Venn diagram of movies that are not part of the canon, not part of any kind of top 10 list I've ever seen, but are also ones that I genuinely love, and then ones that make for interesting observations and storytelling, but also not ones that are so obscure that they're designed just to be cool, or chosen just for social perception. I'm drinking from a Dr. Seuss mug. I don't really care that much about social perception. Not ironically, I genuinely love Dr. Seuss. But I think if you strip away those other factors and you just look just intrinsically at what the horror movie story shows, there's a lot of really compelling factors to really talk about. And it relates to a lot of what I'm interested in, like Bataille's limited experience. Horror movies frame that sort of development of a character based on the limited experience. I mean, some of the best horror movies take a character who has this social facade, and this sort of relates to what I was talking about with the iceberg. One of the reasons I hate the iceberg is because Hemingway's iceberg. One of the reasons I hate the iceberg is because it's a very static, cold, frozen relationship between text and subtext. That's not an accurate depiction of the relationship between text and subtext. It's a vague, inaccurate, horrible metaphor. So, but the relationship between text and subtext is this dynamic process. This is part of what gives the piece lots of energy. Icebergs don't have a lot of kinetic energy. Maybe they have a lot of static energy, but they don't have a lot of kinetic energy. So you look at a horror movie where the character goes through a limited experience. Take Evil Dead. Any of the Evil Dead movies. Another one of those canon movies for sure. The whole, all three of them. One of the rare ones where all three kind of get lumped together as part of the canon. But, what's the experience Ash goes through? He goes through these extreme experiences, and he goes from this facade of normalcy, this facade, like with the playing drunk example that I talked about before. A drunk person pretends to be sober, so that surface level is pretending to be sober in order to fit in this scheme of normality, which, choosing canon movies, is a facade of normalcy, trying to fit in. Choosing an obscure movie just to sound cool is a facade. So the horror movie will put that character, like Ash, through the limit experience, put him through all these, him or her, very frequently her, but put him or her through this limit experience of all these really extreme experiences. And by the end of that, the facade is just ripped away, and the character becomes much more animalistic and much more intense and much more fixated on their own survival and much more brutal. And it definitely relates also to Artaud's Theater of Cruelty. Artaud's Theater of Cruelty, theater in its doubles, as I mentioned before, one of the few books I would use as a textbook at a creative writing class. But that's a lot of what that sort of process of stripping away the facade to the more animalistic, more purely visceral core. It's a lot of what Artaud talks about. So that being said, a lot of the structure. I mean, if you break down the structure of horror movies, a lot of the structure is a character with that facade going through the limited experience. But with horror movies, there tends to be an emphasis on the extremes of the challenge to the character, so that if you break down just the parts of the story that are eliciting visceral response, the dynamic to really see, if you look at the rainbow circle out here, it's really the first two levels. Horror stories are very pure sort of stories, but it's really the first two levels where it's the physical danger, the mortal danger, heightened spikes that middle section, the visceral, the vicarious visceral experience with the character. The contrast between the facade and the animalistic core that pops up by the end of the movie, that's the paradox. So you're switching the two sides of the character. Those two really work together very well. But the way you proportion those two parts, the mortal danger and the characters, balancing those, balancing the facade and the animalistic core. Those two parts can be really balanced in very different ways depending on what movie you're really talking about. So most horror movies will limit the amount of connection you really have to characters, so limit the amount you really feel empathetically for the characters. So the characters, that facade part of it, that'll tend to function as a distancing mechanism, so that, they're terrible people, so they distance you from, feeling things about them. So when they die, there's a spike of visceral stimulation from just the intense imagery, the suddenness, the whatever else, all these different sorts of, intensely stimulating visceral images. That'll spike really high, whereas the connection with the character will be relatively low. So a lot of the times in horror movies, the appeal of it may not actually even be the characters. It might just be, this low level connection to the characters spiked really high by intensely visceral stimulation. So that being said, this is the dynamic of the first movie I'm going to choose. The first movie I'm going to choose is a movie called Yellow Brick Road. Came out in 2010. Has very little to do with Wizard of Oz. There's a whole subplot connecting it to Wizard of Oz. Wizard of Oz is one of my favorite stories of all time, for sure. That's a limited experience, but you definitely connect with the characters, for sure. Arguably. But it's a movie about, it has kind of a, Blair Witch type of dynamic, where it's people lost in the woods. And that's a sign that a movie's low budget. If you ever want a sign that a movie's low budget, especially horror movies will do this a lot. If a movie's shot in the woods, it's low budget, because you don't have to pay a license to shoot in the woods a lot of the time. Anyway, there's people lost in the woods. That's your basic setup. This whole town, I like the setup of this mystery. The mystery is this whole town just left and went up into the mountains and got lost. And so this other expedition goes to try to solve that mystery, and they get lost. It's a simple setup, but what I love about it, and this is a movie, I don't think anybody else in the world loves this movie. I was trying to remember when it came out, and I looked it up on IMDb, and I almost looked at a review. It was a 1-star review, and I said, turn her away. I don't want to know. It's because I want to try to do this as untaintedly as possible. Because if I find out everybody hates this movie, is that perception going to shape my assessment? There's something going on in the street. Is that conformity to that opinion? And all of my complaints about these things tainting genuine opinions are the exact same flaws you have in the Iowa system of workshops. It drives me crazy. But anyway, is someone else's opinion going to taint my genuine assessment of the piece for its own sake? Yes, it is. Yes, absolutely. Anyway, is conformity to what other people feel a problem with genuine assessment? Absolutely. So, back to Yellow Brick Road. I easily get distracted by complaining about the Iowa model. It's getting cold. So Yellow Brick Road. What I love about Yellow Brick Road, and nobody else in the world may love this, who knows, who cares, but the structure of the story is that once they get up into the mountains, they start hearing this sound. And that's the movie, really. They start hearing this sound in the distance. No real explanation of what the sound is, and I think that's for the best. When you have a mystery like that. Presumably, it's some kind of ghostly figure. But, any sort of explanation would undermine just the impact of the absurdity of the sound. It reminded me a lot of an Ionesco sort of a plot. And Ionesco's my biggest hero of all time. The Killer Without Reason, for example. The structure reminded me somewhat of like Berenger arguing with the killer without reason. Because the killer is just standing there, just not doing anything. And Berenger goes through all these arguments about why, killing is wrong. And he's sort of, the structure of that speech alone is just all over the place. But the sound is fairly steady. It's just, this pervasive force, which is just not something you see. That's one of the reasons I really love it, is because it's hard to really compare it to any other horror movie. You don't really have a horror movie where the killer is just standing there and people go crazy because he's not doing anything. But yeah, it's just this sound. And so all the hikers just go crazy because, they get lost. They can't find their way. The sound is going on. They just go crazy eventually, and they just start killing each other. And you get that sort of thing on like a desert island, or you get that with like zombie movies where the deaths happen partly because of the the survivors in isolation go crazy. But when do you ever have a movie that's that old genre, the sound-based insanity? But yeah, it's fascinating. It's definitely fascinating. I don't really remember that much about the characters. That's what I'm saying. I mean, the characters were interesting. They were interesting enough to make it a really compelling horror movie. But the most fascinating thing about it is just the unique structure of them hearing this sound stuck on this road. And really the juxtaposition of the Wizard of Oz stuff, because, there are references to the Wizard of Oz movie, people watching the Wizard of Oz movie in this town, if I remember correctly. I haven't rewatched it. I mean, it's a great movie, but I haven't rewatched it. But yeah, I mean, that sort of juxtaposition, it's definitely has vibes of surrealism because that juxtaposition is so stark. A very happy sort of a movie image, a very lighthearted movie image, when these people are just brutally murdering each other. And so that's definitely a case. I mean, just the common pattern that you see with really effective horror movies is that you'll have spikes in this, visceral stimulation. This one has just a steady stimulation for the characters. What is this? Ironically, it's stuff like that. It sounds like that in the woods. And you say, where does that come from? Who's making that sound? Where are you? Show yourselves. I think it's much better than Blair Witch. I mean, Blair Witch, I think, gets a lot of credit for starting the found footage genre. But I like Yellow Brick Road a lot more, just because it takes a lot of unexpected twists and turns. But it has that sort of, I mean, there are moments in Blair Witch where they're saying, show yourselves, that sort of thing. That's that sort of dynamic. And then they just murder each other eventually. But it's a steady ramping up. It's a lot of these spikes of visceral stimulation. There's, gory violence, and relatively low connection with the character. But there's still a visceral impact when a character gets killed. But you're not so attached that that the attachment turns into more of a tragic feeling. And I talked about that, like with the sudden death video that I did a little bit ago. If you have a really emotional attachment to a character, and if that character suddenly dies, the feeling is very different than a horror movie because because you have more of an attachment. It becomes a very sad thing. In horror movies, usually deaths, most of the time, deaths are not really sad. They're frightening and they're viscerally stimulating and all that sort of stuff. But if you shifted it from just the horror movie fear, excitement, that kind of stimulation, it would just turn it into a very different stimulation. A lot of horror movies will do that for sure, but it's just a different set of visceral responses. That's all. And they accomplish that by having a relatively low character connection. So, but Yellow Brick Road has definitely a unique structure, very interesting, compelling structure. Even if you don't love the characters in the actual story, it's worth watching just because of the quirky take on story structure. That's for sure, and that's something I'm obsessed with. Unique takes on story structure, and that's definitely an example. But that's the end of the episode. What am I going to pick for number 9? I don't know. I actually don't know. See you in the next episode.